Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton. Let's see here on a Friday evening, doing a show here with Father Patrick on Eastern Orthodoxy and Apokatastasis. Father Patrick, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How
It's
are you?
great to have. Yeah, good. It's great to have you back on. It's been a little while.
Yes.
Yeah. So you wanted to make some comments here on Apokatastasis after we had that show with David Bentley Hart, and so I wanted to just give you a chance here to maybe lay out your view, and I'll interact with it, and also we'll have the chat engage, and maybe we'll have some calls call in a little bit. The number is 1-800-484-3801, 1-800-484-3801. We'll start taking calls probably 20-30 minutes from now, but just go ahead and give the number out there if y'all want to write it down. I'll also put it in the chat, and of course you can ask your questions to @Reason and Theology there in the live chat. But Father Patrick, I'm just going to let you take it on. I mean, what do you think were some of the problems that you had with what were discussed on that show, especially with Dr. Hart's position?
Yes, I'm just sorry. I just have to try to think of it, get my head to a good starting. Yeah, I think his problem is well, it comes down to, I think it's an anthropological problem of what it means to be a human being. There's an issue about the telos of what it is to end up in the eternal position, which are at issue. And then I think issues about the way he's understood freedom, which I sort of agree and disagree with. So there's a lot of things he sort of says, but the way he talks about theosis or freedom, etc., is sort of good and not quite so good. So just to put it in another framework as such, as far as I can understand the fathers, is that the human being, and this is something that I find quite important, is understood as created in the image of God. And what does that mean? It means the three important things which I've picked up from someone like John Chrysostom, St. Basil the Great, is freedom, authority, and the rationality, which is a classic one. We're creatures of rational creatures. But the other two ones I find quite important is freedom and authority. Now, when I talk about freedom here, he was talking about a libertarian freedom of choice, this choice or that choice. This may be quite close, but I like to put the idea of freedom in a slightly different context. And it's a freedom from any external force onto what you decide. So this is a freedom of God, that there is no externality of logic or any force, power, anything greater for him that necessitates him, forces him to do anything. He's utterly and totally free. So there's nothing prior to him in existence. His actions, his things are completely free. And this is a type of freedom that humanity must also have, as well as authority, that humanity is something that has self-authority at the very least. We are self-responsible for our actions. We're self-determining. This is in the image of God. God is self-determining. He is not determined by anything beyond himself. He is self-determining. And humanity must be as well, as also an authority not only of ourselves, but to an extent that God has authority over all creation, all existence. Humanity, in a sense, shares that authority over others. And you see this in the creation of Adam. And why is this important? Because our union with God is such that we participate in the existence of God, and we must participate as God in this sense. To be united to him, to share in his existence, we too must do so freely and with authority. So we cannot be in any way forced by any sense, logic, compulsion, or anything like this to be in this eternal life. We must utterly and absolutely freely accept it. There may be only really one option. There may be a real compelling reason why to be there, but that compellingness, no matter how compelling it is never able to override that freedom. We could always reject it because we're never compulsed. Otherwise, we'd cease to be in the image of God. And we also have our own authority. So in other words, to share in that, we must take the responsibility for ourselves of being like God. The likeness of God must be something which we take on for ourselves. This is a sort of critique of the Protestant position as well. We must own and work the virtues for ourselves. We must be responsible for our actions, etc. God cannot force us to be good. He cannot make us magically good or anything like this. He can give us all the help we need. He can give us the grace and everything. And we utterly need the grace. We can't be good without his help. But we must use that grace of our own authority, of our own control, and our own freedom. Otherwise, we cannot be in the image of God. And so any way that God effectively forces anything, it destroys his own image in the creature. Destroys his own image of what he's created, and he denies the creature the ability to participate in him as himself. And so this is why we had the problem of evil. This is why there are falls from God, because there's a real freedom, there's a real self-determination of humanity, which God has to allow for them to actually participate in his own existence, which is the best thing. He's given all the help there, but there's an utter freedom of humanity which he cannot, control, destroy, or override, or anything like that, without destroying his own image. And this is a sense a great sort of gamble, I suppose, when he creates. But at the same time, the benefit of other people, other creatures, other beings sharing in his existence and the ability for them to do so, which must start from a created starting point, which I think David Bentley points out. We do have to start at a limited point where he can't create us perfect, because otherwise he would just simply be reproducing the sun, generating the sun again. Well, he's done that. The idea of the eternal, perfect generation of himself is already established eternally in the sun. So everything else has to be created temporarily. It has to be created in a limited way. Then it moves from that to its telos in God, the end in God, from a limited point. And in that movement, it has to come through in a free state, that God can't force it into its telos. That movement has to become accepted freely. And it's not about decision or this or that. It's just that utter openness to the creature to say, I want to freely be with this, or freely accept this reality. And obviously the choice, if you reject reality, is that God, well, the other points of God is that God is utterly pure. God has no division. God is simple. He cannot be in a state where there is contradiction inside himself. And so in again, the test of Adam, you have to test his freedom. You have the tree of God knowledge with a command, a rational command. Again, this touches the rationality. We can understand a rational command. It's an abstract thing, and we can choose to do it or not to do it. This touches on, again, we must be rational creatures to be God, because God, in the sense of the word, the logos, reason, etc., God is rational, to be in his image. But as soon as we have a contrary will, we disobey God, we create division. And obviously God is pure. We can't be united to God if we have a contrary will to him, and we fall, and humanity and all creatures, or any creature, cannot of itself exist, have life of itself, because that would mean that somehow God is not everything. God is not all reality. God is not all life. He's not this thing that sustains all things. So nothing can exist of itself apart from God. So it will fall to death. It falls to corruption. It loses its ability to go. And once it's in that state, it's also stuck in that state. God can't relate to it because it's contrary to himself. That's the whole history of Christ's resurrection from the dead, etc. So we've got the fall, and that's sadly the case of what humanity does. Now, in the other thing about creation is that temporal creation, temporality is actually, in a sense, contrary to God. God is unmoving, unchanging being. What is time and space, which is about time and change and movement, is not consistent with God. It in itself is, in a sense, contradictory to God. So in the Christian sense, I mean, you've got the Buddhists and stuff that all struggle with this. How do we, Platonists, you have to some sort of fall from God and have to come back to God because this is, and you have some sort of cyclic process and just say, well, that's reality, is just sort of a cycle thing going back and forward. But you can't stay in this movement. You've got to keep going back to the stability. But obviously, we've got this movement. How do we fall from the stability? So I had this sort of cyclic thing going around. Christianity says, right, no, what happens is God, of his freedom, his free choice, creates time and space. He creates the limited creature with movement. But this creation has to have an end. It has to come back into the eternity of God. It cannot remain in a temporal state ad infinitum, because then you would have something coexisting with God that would be contrary to God's stability. So in the end, there is an end of time. There is a movement from time or change, which is measured by time. So once we have the last day, so the last judgment, we move beyond the state of change. We move into whole creation, moves into a new mode of existence, in a sense, into the eternity of God. And so at this stage, we have an end of time and change. And therefore, whatever state something is at this point is a permanent and eternal state. There is no, at this judgment, there's no change afterwards. Now, he was talking about, well, I asked him, well, how long does he, before the guy makes his mind up to, after the judgment, to come into sort of union? And he sort of thought, well, there's no time. But the point of saying there's no time is there's no change. So that whatever state you're in is unchangeable. That doesn't mean, though, in a sense, that there is not continual growth of the creature from glory to glory, because we can look at it in a relativistic position. In an absolute sense, there's no change. The creature receives its heavenly reward or its eternal punishment as such. But because you're a limited creature starting into an infinite gift, the creature's perspective, it's an infinite experience of infinitely growing into the infinite gift and infinitely moving into it. So you've got the creature experiences glory to glory to glory ad infinitum. It never ceases or gets bored or stops, because it's infinitely moving into an infinite life and existence. And the deafened is almost infinitely long. The separation is also infinitely falling, in a sense. Now, the other thing I meant to mention is that God's image that he creates in us, it cannot be destroyed, because it is actually the image of God. God would deny himself in his own creature to destroy it. So he cannot destroy what is good or very good, because then he would deny himself. So our creation, well, he resurrects everyone, the living and the dead. And so they are all permanent, eternal, because the image is the image of God. It is indestructible. God will not destroy it. He will sustain it eternally because it's in his own image. What he does is to stop evil, which he must. He prevents the images from acting evil, thinking evil, being active. He binds them in chains and stuff, puts them in utter darkness, removes them from relationships to other people, so that they're no longer able to affect others with any negative thoughts and stuff. He constrains and binds them up, so that against their will, in a sense. I know that he wishes everyone to live in their will, but he has to stop evil eventually. So in the end, telos, these people are bound. and the state of hell as such. And as I said, that at the end, that is an impermanent state, because the end for everybody at the last resurrection is to move the whole system into an eternal state. And whatever state you're in at that stage, that's it. But he needs to do that to give the fullness of the eternity to the good, to those participating in him, and to stop the contradiction of existence with himself. Yes. What was the other? Oh, yes. The other important thing is that humans are soul and body creatures. So whatever we do, our judgments, our actions are only judgeable or repentable when we are together as soul and body. So we judge for our deeds what we do in the body. Once we separate from the body, our soul is no longer in a state to repent, because it's no longer in a state with the body to act as a united whole. It's separate. It's dead. It's not part of it. So its actions without the body cannot be the complete human action, and therefore its decisions, etc., are not truly representative of what its eternal telos will be, which is the union together. So again, our time for judgment, our time for repentance is only in the flesh, only while we're still together as a combined human whole. Once that death separates the body out, the soul is not in a position to repent. It's not in a position to change. Any change or benefit that the soul receives in Hades, as such, or the waiting place for the final resurrection of the body, is by the prayers of saints who love the soul despite what it did in the body, and it allows God to forgive the sins of the soul to a certain degree for what it did in the body, because of the saints' prayer of the love of it. Nothing to do with the actual soul itself repenting. It's about the God on the behalf of the others saying, look, we're prepared to live with this person eternally. Please let us do so. We're praying for this. And God go, okay. And again, this is to a limited extent, because some people, it's not to be able to override the ultimate freedom of that person. And this is the other point, I think, of David. He was sort of talking about attachment. Oh, well, the God couldn't allow someone to be attached to someone human and missing the person if they're gone in hell. Well, I think there's two problems with that. Is one, that when God is our end, God is our fulfillment, everything that we can have or know or things is God. God is the fullness. Well, there really is nothing to miss. Once you're in union with God, you have the fullness of reality, every part of reality. And so we do not lack anything in God being all in us. And the attachment, when he talks about, is a story almost very much a type of attachment Christ warns against, the attachment to family, to friends and stuff, which we are to die to. These are a worldly attachment. This is attachment of the flesh. And the matter of fact, if you die in this state of attachment, you will die with the one to whom you're attached. So this is a problem. So yeah, so the idea is that due to the nature of our created in the image of God, and our telos in the existing being as God, with God as God, not. And this is again why Orthodox talk about essence and energy distinction, is that we are not God in essence, we remain creatures, but in all other respects, we participate in the life of God, the existence of God, the love of God, the thing, and we must participate in his unity, his purity, and all these other things. It's a very high calling, but we get to share in his infinite existence, and as far as we can expand into as human beings, this is where we are basically called to be God. But in so being like that we have to be so in complete union with God and complete harmony with God. We get all freedom within the parameters of God. But as soon as we do something which divides, he can't bring us into it without denying himself. And this is the other key. He can never deny himself. He cannot deny his image in us. He cannot deny himself and his purity and his holiness and all the rest of it. And for us to participate in him, we must be free. We must have that self-responsibility. And he respects that utterly. And this is when where we, for those in hell, we have to understand it. That is their choice. They've had the freedom in their actions, and they will be judged according to how they've used that. Obviously, the younger the person goes, the less freedom of that. But then there's the less issue or the punishment or anything of a nature in there. Conversely, in heaven, the deeper you get into your faith and to grow closer to God, the greater your glory you'll receive and shine into. Even though we all move into infinity, the deeper you can get into that starting position of your gift and your ability to receive that gift, the greater the glory that you'll participate in your eternal existence. So we don't want to cut anyone short unnecessarily of developing into God. So it's all about who God is. It's about our freedom, our authority, and that these things cannot be overturned without destroying his own image in us. And he can't do that because he denied himself. And that's one thing we know that God can't do, is deny himself. So that is the logic to why I think apokatastasis just doesn't work metaphysically, theologically. And the Christian message is, there is an eternal state of those who are not willing to receive eternal life. And there is an end, and it has to be that end. Sadly or whatever, but that is reality, and I don't see even God could do much else about it. He's doing his best to try to make it as good as possible.
I have a couple questions here. So let me first ask this. As an Eastern Orthodox priest, do you think that the doctrine of apokatastasis, not necessarily Origin's version, but just kind of the modern one put forward by some Orthodox, do you think that it's heretical or just in error?
Well, there's two ways of answering the question. Right. When we talk about something that's heretical, we can talk about it, anything like if you deny marriage or drinking wine or something, that is actually a heresy. In a state, if you talk about heretical things, any sort of thing contradictory to the tradition of the church, any sort of error is in a sense a heresy. It's an opinion that it's contrary to truth. And so in a sense it's heresy. For me to state that it's a heresy, though, would mean that only the bishops and council can actually formally state that this is a particular heresy and condemn somebody for it. So I'm not in a position to start to define or state that this is or isn't actually a heresy. I mean, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, if you take the anathemas of just Justinian as being held and supported by the council, which is, I think, there's arguments about that, but I think there's good proof that it was, then yes, we can say that it's condemned as a heresy by the fathers, by the church, and the reception of that has been that is how the church has understood it. And I can stand by saying that it's a heresy on that ground. I'm not in a position myself personally to make that form the same, but I can state that if it is an error, etc., then yes, it is a heresy.
Well, a couple follow-up questions there. For one, even if you were to accept the anathemas there in the Fifth Council as authentic, they're condemning a particular form of apokatastasis of Origen that I think most people in the modern era would not adopt that particular form. So they would say that, okay, even if you accept it, it doesn't condemn my view. It just condemns Origen's particular view. What would you say to them?
Well, it's interesting that I had a look through it. The actual issue in his condemnations is singled out in itself with its own combination for itself. So this is saying that the idea of apokatastasis is in itself wrong, regardless of the context or the other things around why you believe that idea. So by singling it out in its own canon, its own anathema, is to condemn the idea in itself. So in other words, Origen's does not condemn simply as a blanket whole. His various ideas are singled out and each singly condemned in itself. So if you hold any of that particular idea, even without all the rest of the context of the other ones, you still fall under the anathema. So I would say that the way that the anathemas are structured is not just anathemize Origen's system of thought. They go through and actually pull out, we anathemize this idea, we anathemize that idea, we anathemize this idea. And apokatastasis is pulled out in its own little anathema of itself.
So then if it's condemning all forms of apokatastasis, then I have two other follow-up questions then based on that. Here's a quote from Father John Anthony McGuckin, respectable Eastern Orthodox priest and theologian. He says, quote, the anathemata were quietly added to the synodal acts at a later date and have consequently been received as conciliar records from the end of the 6th century onward, a sleight of hand made possible by those who held the key to the archives. So he's claiming that the anathema were added afterwards and were actually not part of 553. What do you think about that? Have you come across anything in your studies that would indicate that no, that's not the case? The anathemas are to be included.
I haven't gone into that in enough detail. I mean, it's taken quite a deep stuff. However, from what I was having to sort of discuss this reasonably recently with people, the evidence, so the earliest evidence is the 6th century that it was associated with the council. It was associated with the fathers of the council. So, and it has been received into the tradition of the church. If it was sleight of hand, and then it's become sort of into the Synodicon and other things, it would suddenly raise a question, well, our understanding of these things is that they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, they're given by Christ, and if anything false or anything added would be quickly picked out by the fathers later on. So the fathers of the 6th Ecumenical Council, for example, would have gone, whoa, what's these things doing attached to this? We're not part of it. But the fact that they said nothing, and the matter of fact, it's sort of just approved of it, and that has been approved into the services and things of the church, and all the fathers of the 7th Ecumenical Council, and these guys were checking these things out. They were interested. The 6th fathers of the Ecumenical were very careful to sort of go through it. I mean, the fathers Trullo going through and trying to reconcile everything and pulling out the canons and say, oh, hold on, this is slightly weird, but how can we reconcile this? So they spent their time going through the material and pulling out what was good about it. So I said nothing about this as being a problem, and yet we do have evidence that these things, as what you just said, from before then, were established or added in. So I'm finding that argument sort of raises a whole lot of other questions that are crazy, other certainties. Now, that's not to say that the anathemas were part of a particular session or the core part of the council stuff. They could have been decided earlier or after or something like that. But that's a separate thing, as we were legitimately added. And it would seem to me that the silence and the building of them into the Synodicon, the other parts of the worship of the church, seems to have been accepted as official. It doesn't matter how exactly they got there. They have been approved as being true reflections of the teaching of the church.
You talked earlier about the reception of 553 and its condemnation there. There's a quote here from the Catholic Encyclopedia that notes the revival of apokatastasis immediately after 553. It says, it was destined, talking about the doctrine, nevertheless to be revived in the works of ecclesiastical writers, and it would be interesting to verify if Costlin and Bardahuer's statements that it can be traced in Bar Sudali, Dionysius the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, Scotus Erigena, and Almaric of Bena. So, the catechism, catechism, encyclopedia, Catholic encyclopedia is not saying that it agrees with this theory that, Maximus taught it, but there are some scholars here saying that Maximus taught it, and I know that's hotly debated. What do you think about that? Have you come across anything in Maximus that was disturbing to you, or that would indicate that he believed in the eternality of people who are in hell? Where do you think he lands on this?
Right. Again, I haven't looked at him in this way systematically through his writings. What I've read of him so far, I have not, something like that has not leapt out of me going, oh my god, what's going on here? So I've never sort of stumbled across, or I don't recall ever stumbling across. I'm sure I would have jumped out at me if he'd been made such a clear statement. So yeah, I'm not surprised some of these doctrines, all sorts of doctrines, keep coming back in and out of all the time. And I mean, it's in some ways, it's a very attractive doctrine. There's
Sure.
some level, I mean,
Sure.
there's a lot of sentimentality for it. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised it coming in. But then, what exactly do we mean by in some ways, yes, of course, there's a restoration. Everything's resurrected. The whole, there is a resurrection of all the living and the dead, good and evil, and everything like that. So, in some ways, there is a type of a universal restoration, but exactly to what level and things like that is other things. So, yeah, until I've read. I have to read him over again and look at all the bits everyone says and analyze them. I haven't done that, but nothing has ever jumped out at me in suggesting that he taught anything that is clearly what Origen would have taught, or to this end.
Yeah. Now, another question that I was curious about, and of course, this is before 553. Saint Gregory of Nyssa and De Anima et Resurrectione, on the soul and resurrection. I don't see a way around it. It seems that he's teaching an ultimate reconciliation for all. I don't know how he could be interpreted in any other way. He might be wrong, but I'm just saying I don't know how to interpret it in any other way. What do you think of Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and arguably Nazianzus, who teaches it, but especially Nyssa?
Yeah. Again, I need to do more homework on this one. Well, I haven't, when I read St. Gregory, I didn't get the full impression again of that, but I've known people think that is that way, and I'd probably have to, maybe if you could provide the quote so I can go over it in detail, to see if there is a way of understanding it. So at the moment, I really can't really say too much. I have known that. I can just say, okay, that was his idea. He was. We don't take it. It's his personal opinion. I'm not going to condemn him for it. No one else has. But so actually, it is interesting that clearly he's not teaching it as openly or clearly as someone like Origen did. Otherwise, you would have thought that they would have lumped them in with that group. So clearly he's expressing it in some way, which is not.
Because he's not teaching the pre-existence of souls and stuff like that, like allegedly Origin was, and so, and out of respect for Nyssa, they didn't include him in there. But as far as just teaching the full restoration, he's clear about it. He sees the fires of hell as purgatorial. They're painful. There's suffering there, but it's eventually going to purify the individual, and he appeals to 1 Corinthians 3, and then he also appeals to Christ being all in all, and so they'll end up being purified, and in this way Christ will be all in all. So he sees that there will be an ultimate reconciliation for all of the damned. But I would admit that is distinct from what we see condemned under the name of Origin there in the anathemas, because again, you have the pre-existence of souls. I think that is the context, even though you're saying that, it condemns it generically. I think it's condemning it with that context in mind, though. But I mean, you could argue and say that no, it's condemning all forms of it, and that's fine. Um, my other question here is kind of a different form of apokatastasis. It's more of the Balthazar view. Metropolitan Callistus Ware has commented on this, and here's a quote for him. This is from Dare We Hope for the Salvation of All, Origen, St. Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Isaac the Syrian. He says, quote, hell exists as a possibility because free will exists. Yet, trusting in the inexhaustible attractiveness of God's love, we venture to express the hope, it is no more than a hope, that in the end, like Walter de la Mare's Traveler, we shall find that there is nobody there. Let us leave the last word, then, with Saint Siloan of Mount Athos. Love could not bear that. We must pray for all. So he seems to come from the perspective that no, we can't say for sure that everyone will be saved, but the Balthazar view that we can hope that all will be saved. What do you say to that? Do you think that that's a legitimate hope, or no, we know that not all will
I'm
be saved?
pretty sure that that's not the case. I mean, it's quite clear in the scriptures that it's eternal hellfire. A worm will not die. The fire. Now, that case, this is where we're using Nyssa. Well, how is this going to be? If Christ Himself says the worm will not die, the worm will never end, the fire will not end. Well, what meaning is a worm or fire except the continuance of hell? And what is the meaning? Meaning to the continuous hell if there's no souls in that hell? So again, and the whole idea of the end of time and things like that, it just becomes incompatible as just sort of I don't know, a sense of sort of continual time where people just slowly come to some sort of awareness. And how long does that exactly go on for? And if time continues in that way, how do we speak about the stability of saints and things like this? So it just starts to raise a whole lot of questions. And I haven't talked about these 3 or 4 fathers who support it. Many fathers who don't. St. John Chrysostom, for example, St. Basil. And it's interesting that St. Gregory of Nyssa isn't one of the 3 ecumenical teachers. So St. Basil, St. Gregory of the theologian, and St. John Chrysostom. These are the 3. If you're going to sort of talk about any doctrine as a single voice, you have to pull out one of these 3 to sort of support yourself. And anyone else, you then need to support an awful lot to start contradicting any of these 3. There is a reason why our universal teachers is because their teaching is pretty sound through and through for all people. So you just start contradicting these guys. So anyone who's sort of running around going, well, so-and-so said, and picks out 3 fathers, and is not touching these 3, is not really getting into the patristic tradition and St. John of Damascus. And, these are the fathers which really have that sort of universal hold. And these are ones, are these guys teaching that? If they are, we accept it. If they're not, or they're condemning it, we should not do that, even if you can find 4 or 5 other fathers who sort of hint at it. So there's a sort of a priority and issue of the patristic consensus on this. And so, yes, occasionally we find fathers that talk about things which are not accepted by other things. Do we condemn them for it? Not always. Sometimes we just quietly pull the rug over it, and just as Ham's sons do, and just quietly leave it behind without making a fuss about it. Sometimes it needs to be, they do need to be condemned. Like Origen, and after his death, there was a reason for that. I can't lay out all the parameters why not, but I think we've got to not jump from one extreme to the other to say, well, one father taught something wrong, therefore he's condemned to hell. Or on the other hand, that we accept everything that every father says without thinking about it. We have to sort of take care to choose in this sort of the wider consensus of the fathers. So yes, that would be my take on that. I also distinguish too with a sense of hope, and I mean, as a limited creature, I've set out a theological position. So I hope I'm wrong.
Sure.
I'd like
Sure.
everybody to be saved. I have no
Yeah.
desire for anybody to go to hell.
Right.
God wants all to be saved.
Right.
So any idea of
Yeah.
his predestined anyone to hell by his choice is to me is an anathema. And you pray for all people, because at any stage you lose your love for and hope for salvation of all. I think you've lost something about the image of God. Does it mean that it's possible? Well, no, I don't think so, because I think there has to be an end, and the ultimate freedom of people is judged in the body. The angels, St. John the Baptist is quite clear that once they've fallen, they don't have a chance to repent again. They're permanently cut off. And the idea that, and again, he's talking about theosis as the fire of theosis. Dave Bentley Hart was, and I think, well, there's a fire of God's love, and in a sense, God is present everywhere. He's present in the hell. I mean, you can't get away from God. And all evil will stop and stuff. The image that is preserved is full of the fullness. All God is all in all. But it doesn't mean that the person is not chained from their own self-action in that. The fire of love can burn as hell if you obviously don't want it there. Then it becomes a hell when someone loves you and you don't want them to love you. It could be in a positive, actively pushing themselves into your face. Well, obviously, even in hell, God is in the sense you're in his image. You can't escape him. I mean, he is there sustaining his own image in you. You want to disappear, but you can't. So this compounds to, but in a sense, your contradiction in action and your energies as such, your activities is still. So there's no longer any. Everything's at peace in a sense with God, and there's no more evil. In a sense, it's reconciled at some level there. But to talk about theosis is applying the union, which is a active participation in God, free, active, determined active participation in God. And that is something only for the holy. And also, I think in the scriptures talks about once you're in hell, how do you get to know God? Because God is not, in a sense, you're in his image, but it talks about in the Psalms that, how do those in hell praise God, etc. How to get to know God. It is a sort of an issue of once you've gone into the darkness, that is, God does not know you. And I don't know you. It is a sort of an almost a separation of the ability to be known or to come back again. And I don't think David anywhere addressed that. And I think that is a sort of the continuing issue of what mechanism are you talking about for this apokatastasis to come into place, unless you're talking about some sort of continuing permanent space-time sort of situation, which I think has a theological problem with it, and eternal consistency of God.
Now, another one of the questions that I have related to some things that you've said here, and also related to what we just read with Metropolitan Callistus, is something that Elder Sophroni recounted, and I'm going to read it here. I remember a conversation between Helm, St. Siloan the Antonite, and a certain hermit who declared, with evident satisfaction, God will punish all atheists. They will burn in everlasting fire. Obviously upset, the star had said, "Tell me, supposing you went to paradise and looked down and saw somebody burning in hellfire, would you feel happy?" "It can't be helped. It would be their own fault," said the hermit. The stars answered him with a sorrowful countenance. "Love could not bear that," he said. "We must pray for all." What do you think here of the appeal to Saint Silouan the Anthonite, modern saint From Mount Athos. What do you think of the appeal that they're making here, that he maintained that a loving God could not bear them to be eternally in hell? What do you think about that?
Again, well, as I said, the way I'm modeling it, it's not that it's because of who he is. It is because of what people need to be created in his image that the situation arises. And there's not much you can do about it, because if he to fix that, it can only be if he destroys his own image, he denies himself. So the possibility of the creature participating in himself as himself requires it to be in his image, free and self-determined. And this very freedom cannot be denied by God. And so, in a sense, the love of God for the creature would be to destroy. It wouldn't be to destroy the creature, deny his own image in the creature. It would be a denial of his love for the creature. So in a sense, the love of God respects the freedom of the creature, the image of a creature, the self-responsibility of the creature. It does not force him dragging and screaming against his will into eternity. And as I said, the idea of or temporal, well, he'll eventually make his mind up to do that. I think there's lots of problems the way what we're conceiving of hell in that. Does that mean we say, ooh, yeah, and then laugh at someone in hell, or take a sort of attitude, oh, it's his fault, it's sort of high and mighty? That's something about us. There's something wrong with us, where we're somehow self-righteous, where this is a sense of ego or pride or something like that, which is condemnable in itself. So anybody who's acting in a way of laughing or not, in a sense, sad, or not praying or hoping for the best, and has any sort of delight in the suffering of someone in hell, I think that is a problem. But a quiet acceptance of the thing, because that is the way it is, that for love of that person, for love of their freedom, for love of their responsibility, if that's a choice they've made, total respect for them in the image of God. It's a real, actually, it's in some ways, it's actually stating they are really respecting them as God, in a sense, by that's the choice. They've chosen not to live in unity with God, but I'm actually respecting them as God. I mean, it's an ultimate honor to them in a way, because it's ultimately respecting their freedom. They have a divine image in which they are created, which has led to the situation there. And if I sort of think otherwise, in some ways I'm sort of almost just denying God, or I'm attacking God. So yeah, it's a way of perceiving this. What are we talking about? And I think if it's focused on the divine image in the person, that freedom, that authority, and the utter respect for that, the utter love for that as the image of God, and then I think this re-perspectivizes the matter, and it's not it's fault, but it's just like, yeah, it's sad, but we've got to respect that in them. And if I don't, I'm fundamentally denying myself, I'm denying God, and I'm denying them as well as who they are in the image of God. So yes, that's really how I'd come at it. It's just a perspective change.
If you want to call with your live question, it's 1-800-484-3801. Again, 1-800-484-3801. And I also put it in the live chat there. We have a question over here from Benjamin D. He says, given that annihilationism hasn't been condemned to my knowledge, would that be just as heretical to believe in Eastern Orthodoxy? What do you think, Father?
As I argued, I would say, again, I can't judge what is a heresy, not as a heresy as such, but I would say that doesn't work. You don't get that in the scriptures. It would be quite clear if Christ said, look, If you don't, you'll just be annihilated into nothing. He doesn't. He talks about you'll be thrown into the lake of fire. All actually will be resurrected. What a meaningless waste of time to resurrect everybody if we're just going to annihilate them. So that in itself, and then put them in hell. What a waste of time that is. So the very fact everybody is resurrected and then goes to hell would imply that no, there's no annihilationism. And as I said, ultimately, we are created in the image of God. What we are created is very good. God would be denying himself. He would be contrary to himself to destroy his own creation. He can't. It would be a great evil to destroy what is very good. Again, as I said, it's all about that in hell for the very image of God in them to be supported and respected is why the situation comes, and God would be denying himself to do anything otherwise, including annihilating them. So yeah, it's just, I think I would say it's reality. I don't think there's much God can do to get around it. If he wants to create us to participate himself, he has to create us in an image, and we have to fulfill our likeness. We have to do that freely, and he can't end up destroying that image because it's something permanent, because that's what he is. And so if he's just creating something temporal that is actually in itself a dead end and meaningless activity of God, is not compatible. So he has to create things that are going to be eternal. Otherwise, he'd be creating death in itself, which would be contrary to himself. So yes, I think annihilationism is a mistake, theological mistake, because it basically denies where we created the image of God.
Victoria is quoting from the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and that there would be an end to punishment and a restitution of devils to their pristine state and other innumerable insane blasphemies. And I think this is the part where you were referring to, that you were claiming it
There
is
is
a blanket
actually
condemnation.
another one of Justinian's ones, which is actually a bit more specific on the
A little bit
restoration
more. Okay.
thing. There is this one as well, which does touch on it, which is
Yeah.
more that group one within one of Origen's things. Now, this is more definitely part of the, part of the council. The other ones which are a little bit more uncertain, but generally 6th century, as I said, supports that. But yeah, in end of punishment, again, that's, well, the Apokatastasis does imply an end of punishment and a restoration of devils to their pristine state. Because obviously we won't start any sentient being, devil, the fallen angels as such, to be restored back to their positions, would also be part of that. So yeah, again, there's all sorts of interesting problems about trying to work out restoration of the devil into. And then if that was possible, why hasn't that already happened? Things like that. So, yeah.
Some take a modified view here and say, okay, well, we don't include the devil and his fallen angels in the full restoration, but we include all humans. And so that's the way they kind of escape that anathema there. Not saying it's right. I'm just telling you that's the way we do it. I mean, just like this one, John James asks, "What is the worm?" Of course, from Isaiah, that dieth not. Again, some of the ways that people, evade this is that they'll note that first of all, it could refer to God's wrath, and again, God's wrath and punishment towards sin might be eternal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the sinner will be eternally punished. It just means God always has a wrathful disposition towards evil. But another, I think it was Dr. Ehrman when he was on the show, when I asked him about this, he was talking about how, of course, obviously there's no real worm. This is clearly a metaphor. And so, if the worm's a metaphor, the eternality aspect could also be a metaphor. And, it just means for a very long period of time. So it doesn't necessarily mean eternal suffering. So, I mean, that's the way that some people try to, account for this. Any comments on that one, Father?
Again, it's an interesting idea of a worm. And interesting, we are resurrected in a real physical body. Our physical bodies are resurrected. So in some ways, talking about some form of physicality in the eternal hell position isn't actually incompatible with our resurrected state as physical beings. So there could well be some form of physicality to the suffering, because if we are physical beings, then there's no reason why we're not also existing in a physical context as we do now. It actually seemed a bit strange that we were created and resurrected in physical bodies without a physical context. And our body will suffer with the soul, and it will suffer proper to its own character, which is physical. So I would think that actually you've got to be careful not to abstract away physicality too much without denying the resurrected physical body. Though the type of physicality we experience then is not the type which we do now. We're in a new mode of existence, in a sense. This is Christ appeared through walls and doors and stuff and came and went. The type of way that physicality works in the age to come is something unlike the way we experience it now. Nevertheless, it could be very much still a physical thing, because we would still live in the physical context to some degree in some way. Now, worm is usually a symbol of corruption. It's a symbol of something dying. The worms come into the body and eat it up. So in a way, what we could be talking about here is that, in a sense, as I said before, when you separate from God, we start at a point of life. We start at the limited point of life. But we, in a sense, there's almost a 0 point of existence, which we never sort of get to, but we're continually corrupting into, in a sense, for those in hell. So in a sense, the corruption, the dying, the process of the dying is almost falling into an eternal hole of death sort of thing, where your actions and stuff is sort of almost and feeling constantly sort of getting smaller and darker and things like this. Now, exactly how that works, I'm not sure, but I think it does point to a sort of, because the physical body and things does exist constantly, it doesn't actually change, it doesn't die. So what we're talking about is a sort of state of the fall into death continually being continued forever. And this is a symbolic way of speaking about that sort of death, the physical and sort of thing. With well, exactly. Sort of, because the body obviously is resurrected and not dying, but in some way it participates with the soul in the eternal death. So exactly how that works, I don't know. But this symbol does actually seem quite appropriate for what is going on.
5-a-day productions. Sorry for writing the same thing. I'm worried it might get lost. Did any Western fathers teach anything like the Originist view minus pre-existence of the souls? I mean, offhand, I'm not familiar, but I imagine there were some who did. I just can't, think of any off the top of my head. In the West, it seems this was very much discouraged as far as a view, just because of the influence of Augustine in his City of God. He's very, very clear against this view. He talks about some Christians who maintained it, and he mocks them basically, and notes how terrible of a view it is in his estimation. And so again, a lot of people in the West followed Augustine, so they picked up on that. But you might find some people in the West, I'm sure. There's bound to be some on you. Father, do you want to comment on that?
I was just saying, I don't know of anyone in particular. Origen was basically using a sort of a Platonic idea of reality. I mean, it's very similar shared with Hindu idea of reality, Buddhist idea of reality is just sort of the one. Well, it's the only way to explain how do we get time and space from the one. Either it's the animation from the one that goes into sort of falls into time and space and then cycles back again. So you get creatures sort of falling and returning. And now that idea may have been shared by some other people who are interested in Plato and this philosophical idea. It's one of the philosophical, well, the legitimate attempts of humanity trying to sort out why on earth we got this time-space existence. Everyone accepts that God's there. That's obvious. But how on earth do we get this time-space situation? Obviously, the Christian way, the Judeo-Christian way, is that God creates ex nihilo. He is the stability. There is no time-space eternally as such. There is no. It is a temporal, singular, linear thing that comes to an end in a sort of the final resurrection, the final judgment sort of thing, which is the main Christian thought. But I don't know. Yeah, as I said, the Platonic thought may have snuck into other people's thought over in Oregon, but I don't know of anyone whose writings are still extant which did teach that.
Last question here. This one was from, well, it just moved on me. There it is. Sigmund. What is the best argument for apokatastasis in your estimation?
For it?
Yeah.
Well, I think siloan was talking about, yes, okay, the love of God, who doesn't want to see anybody suffering or anyone in hell. I think that is a good argument for it. So in that sense, and I think David Bentley Hart sort of goes on that line. And so I think that is a good argument for it. The only, as I said, the counter argument is what we're talking about by the image of God. What is humanity, etc., and how does that work in its interplay with its relationship with God? But yeah, if I'm sure, I mean, I would be happy to have everybody. And I wouldn't want it. I'll put it this way: I wouldn't want everybody to suffer. It gets a little bit more interesting if I want to spend the eternity with someone like Hitler, because again, it's a high view of eternity. We're basically inside each other with 24/7. We can't escape anybody. You're with everybody all the time in a perfect bond of love, which is a greater bond of love than possible in human existence. But you can't escape anyone who's bad because they're there. And so if our evil is in there, they corrupt the whole thing. Becomes a complete torment. It becomes hell for everybody else. They have to be put out, and so I wouldn't think it just doesn't make any sense for the compatibility that someone who is hellbent for evil and their selfishness and is contrary to this sort of community to be just put in there because we love them, because it would destroy the entire it's quite incompatible, destroy the eternity. So they have to be chained away. And again, in the respect of their ultimate freedom of their and self-responsibility, I love them so much that there is a certain justice and a certain stability that's needed for the sake of everybody else. Just as we do in modern society, put people in jail because ultimately, it's not that I hate them. It's just if I let them loose, it's just going to be utterly destroy everything else. And we can't. And the only way to constrain them is to put them in hell, in a sense. You can't have them in eternity programmed to robotically be good because you destroy them as being a human being, as in the image of God. They're suddenly become a senseless robot. It'll be meaningless for their existence to happen. They'll be even worse than being in hell, in a sense. At least they have a real existence as a real image of God. So, yeah. That would be the best argument, but sadly, I think there are some problems of, I'd hope, but I just think there's certain characters out there, no matter how much you hope, may not really be up to what it requires to be the perfection of life. It is seriously high bar. What we're talking about in eternal life, there is no joke about its perfection. That's why it's only achievable by grace, and we've got to be. God is all in all. In other words, you've got to freely accept God as all He is, every part of His holiness, every part of His love, every part of His kindness, tolerance, everything has to be completely full in you as far as He is. And not many people are really willing to allow that to be truly the case. and completely accepting his will in complete unity with that, even if it contradicts what you want to do. You've got to cut that. And so it's actually, heaven is a perfection. God gives us all the power to get there, all the strength we want, all the help. But to us, for really break our egos to really want that to be the case, detach from this material time space existence which we're in, to live in an eternity, I just and only in a short space of time. We don't have forever to do it, because God can't give us forever, as he says. So yeah, much as I hope, much as I love, yeah, I think there is some big problems of trying to talk about it as being a given.
Last one. We'll do this one really quickly. Could the corporeal punishment be temporal, but the eternal separation from the vision of God eternal as a way to reconcile the views? Some people take that position and will say, okay, just as the Western tradition for, some Western Christians will assert that maybe these souls in hell after a period of purgation end up in limbo. So they still are devoid of the vision of God, but they have a natural communion and a natural happiness. But the eternal punishment would still be that they don't have the vision of God. They don't have a supernatural union with God. Some might take that position. I doubt very seriously that that would be more of a Western view. I don't see a whole lot of Eastern Christians adopting that view. Father, brief comments there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as I said, the body is resurrected with the soul on the last day, and that last day means the end of time. That is why it's called the last day, and therefore there's no change. So there is no temporality of whatever happens to the body-soul combined unit at that stage. It's eternal for both the body and the soul. We can't sort of talk about a continuing time for the body and not for the soul. So yeah, no, temporality and as such comes to an end at the last day, for the body and for the soul. So yeah, there's just really not much space for that.
I don't see any more there in the chat, and we're limited on time. I know it's late over there in the UK. So, Father, let me give you a chance to have the last word here, real quickly. Just some brief concluding thoughts, parting words.
Yeah, as I say, it's the key, I think, is about understanding who God is and who we are in the image of God, and looking at God as eternal, unchanging being and his relationship to time and change. So, in other words, he's created us in his image to participate in himself, but he must do so freely, and we must be responsible for our own actions. He can't make us good. He can give us all the help, we can be good, but we've got to take that and responsibly enact that for ourselves. So we are good of ourselves as well as him. So we are like him. Otherwise, we're not like him. He can't make us robots. So this is totally beyond to do anything other. He's to deny himself in us and destroy us, and destroy his own image in us, and destroy his creation. It'd just be totally contradictory to himself. So, and there must be an end of temporality. There must be an end of time and change. Otherwise, we would have an existence, something contradictory to God in the permanent state. That can't be the case. There's got to be an end of time and things. So, given this context and our lifespan, we have to be in the body and the soul, for what we act, for how we're judged. And at the end of time, when our body's resurrected, there's no extra time for that to start to repent at that stage. It is there for judgment. So, yeah, there's really no theological space for this. And as I said, the priority is what we are in the image of God, what that means, and who God is. And this is what's driving everything. It's not a lack of love. It's not a hatred or anything like that. It's just a simple the reality of who God is and what it means to participate with him and to exist eternally with him.
Excellent, Father. I appreciate you coming on. It's been a while. We need to have you on more often. I hate to keep you up late in the UK, but still, we need you on more. So we'll see if we can get you on some more in some of the upcoming shows. But once again, thank you so much for coming on, Father. Always a pleasure.
You're welcome.
And thank y'all for all engaging there in the chat. Don't also forget to comment and also like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell for notifications, and also check us out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you would like to support what we're doing. Until next time, God bless.